Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Thanks for joining us for our regular strategy conversation with leading thinkers that's dedicated to the memory of one of the nation's most influential strategists, Andy Marshall. Joining us now is retired United States Navy Admiral Scott Swift, the former commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, who now has multiple affiliations, including with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, but also leads the Swift Group Consultancy. Sir, thanks so very much for joining us.
Great to be with you again. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
I want to start off with the broader question of sort of the nature of the competition between the United States and China. The Trump administration says that it sort of understands the nature of this competition and has crafted a strategy in order to address it. Obviously, the pandemic has stoked tensions between Washington and Beijing. China is mounting a global PR campaign, but it's also really working to intimidate and pressure nations across the Pacific. Intimidation, which appears sort of to be working. And underlying this appears to be China's sort of motto of sort of win without fighting, intimidate, corrupt, co-opt, misinform. How do you think folks in Washington need to be looking at this challenge? What is the nature of this challenge in order to best address it?
Well, that is a great question. Succinctly stated, conjures up a very long response, probably not appropriate for this podcast. But let me condense my thoughts and let you unpack them as you desire. The first thing I would say is that China has a grand strategy. And I have been saying and writing for some time, thinking about this before I retired and certainly writing about it since I retired. And that is that the United States does not have a grand strategy. Now, I've got good friends that argue the alternative, that grand strategy is kind of baked into our culture. But I would suggest that's not the case. And without a grand strategy, it's difficult to have a regional strategy. Now, the work that was done on the NSS, I think, was excellent. And I think that puts us in a much better place than where we were before, that document. But I would argue the NSS is more representative of a regional strategy than a grand strategy. Grand strategy includes a whole of government and a whole of nation approach. I'll leave that as it is. From that context, I think it's very important that we get back to thinking strategically, planning operationally, and acting tactically. And what I have seen really throughout my military career, and I've seen it now since I've retired in industry and in business, is that what we do is we think tactically, we plan tactically, and we act tactically, and then we're frustrated when we can't seem to get out ahead of the problem. We're much more adept as a country, as a government, and the elements of government to jump crisis to crisis. We're very comfortable dealing with crisis. Those are binary yes, no, right, wrong, 1-0 kind of problem sets, as opposed to strategic and operational problems, which are much more subjective. You're transitioning from the art of dealing with, or the science of dealing with problems, to the art of dealing with problems. Let me pause at that point, Vago, and for any comments that you may have. And I would like to talk specifically about the current administration and its approach to China, and expand on that a little bit as well.
Yeah, of course. That's where I was going to go. And look, right, critics will say one of the reasons that we don't have a good naval strategy or good unifying military strategy is that everything is a bit of a tactical response, as opposed to positioning and posturing for those kind of longer term strategic challenges. And I want to get to that a little bit in the conversation. But somewhat more specifically, to talk about the Trump administration. The administration has said we've got a great national security strategy. The national defense strategy has won plaudits from both sides of the aisle for it being actually a pretty good national defense strategy. On the other hand, the question is that if the president of the United States does not believe in what that document says in terms of engaging with allies and partners and engaging in this competition as opposed to it being transactional in nature. We have serious problems with our two most important allies in the Pacific, Japan and South Korea, over basing payments. That is really, I think, dangerous is probably an understatement in terms of the frustration in Tokyo and Seoul toward the United States that, hey, look, we increased our amount of money and now you're putting us over a barrel again. They're repeatedly asking for more money. What is the strategy and the approach, right? So if you're engineering this grand strategy, what does that grand strategy look like in all of its component parts?
Well, quickly, I would say a grand strategy is made up of a part A and part B. And part A is captures in a context of who do we as America, as Americans, how do we think of ourselves internal to our borders? You know, what are our core interests? You know, what are the things that make us Americans and make this country America? There's three documents that certainly are part of building out that strategy. One is the Declaration of Independence, the other is the Bill of Rights, and of course the Constitution. Not limited to those three, but they should certainly be capstones, cornerstones to the development of that grand strategy. The part B of a grand strategy is, how do we think of the world from in our context? In a perfect world, what would that world look like from an American perspective? The process of building that part A and part B, and I should say that that grand strategy is made up of very broad statements, such as, we believe these truths to be self-evident, not with specificity. The idea is that this strategy needs to survive largely intact the transition between administrations, especially if there's a party change that is included within that transition. From that grand strategy is built out regional strategies. The process of building a grand strategy includes, I asked the question, how many cabinet level departments are there in the administrative branch? And few people can answer that question. There's 15, and all 15 of them need to be engaged in developing this grand strategy, because what the prime peer competitor that we have is China, and all of its branches of government are fully engaged in developing their grand strategy. And that people will say, well, there's impossible to build a grand strategy because we're so disconnected within and divergent within our country and within our government. And my response to that, the process is more important than the product, the process of building the grand strategy. That's why it's so difficult when you talk about what should the grand strategy be. The focus of that grand strategy in its application as a regional strategy, in this case focused on China, the competition is really focused on the rules-based order and the mechanisms, more important that the mechanisms by which that rules-based order is managed and by which it is changed. That's a whole nother discussion, but it's not. It is about the economy. I use Dime Phil as the example. It's also, and it is about the military as well, but it's not just those things. It's diplomatic. Our freedom of navigation is being limited in the economic domain and in the military domain, as it is in the diplomatic domain, the information domain, the financial domain, the intelligence domain, and the legal domain, and many other domains. That's really what this competition is about. So there's this discussion that's going on about this pandemic, and people are saying, oh my goodness, we never saw that coming. Whoa. I differ with that. We didn't see it coming strategically because we are too focused on the crisis du jour. We need to step back as a country, certainly at the strategic level, and look for the black swans, the blind spots out there. The military has been invested, I wouldn't say heavily invested, in pandemics, germ warfare, biological warfare. I've trained to that throughout my 40-year career in the Navy. So this isn't something new. The problem is it isn't something that we've been sufficiently focused on. We didn't recognize it as a black swan. And now the surprise that we're seeing is reflective of the fact that we don't have this big strategic approach of thinking strategically, planning, operational, and acting tactically with respect to these threats that we recognize as being out there because we train to them at the tactical level.
I couldn't agree with you more that when it came to pandemic, that was certainly right. I mean, if you read Andy Krepinovich's book, Seven Deadly Scenarios from 2009 or 7 or whatever Andy's book was, I think number 3 is a pandemic.
Yeah.
And I know that there were folks who were working that in 2003. There was a lot of activity, obviously, when SARS broke out. And the United States has always been that indispensable power that's tapped people on the shoulder to sort of said, hey, you guys got that? Do you need any help with that? Because that looks like it's going to be a problem. Let me ask you how you think this administration is doing and what it's doing right and what it's doing wrong vis-a-vis getting ready for these challenges.
I think that this administration suffers from the same challenge of previous administrations, and that's being continually drawn back into the here and now. I saw this in my military experience. Now that I've retired, the consulting that I do, I see it in defense contractors. I see it in publicly held companies, privately held companies. They are better at setting a time horizon further than what the government does. The government is truly drawn back into whatever the apparent crisis is. The crisis of the front page or the crawler on the bottom of the news channel. But they're not looking out as far as they need to optimize their response. The good thing that I think this administration has done is I think it has made the box bigger that we should be thinking in strategically. I go back to some of the things that the president has done. Some say out of ignorance and some say out of brilliance. I'm not familiar enough to be able to characterize them. But his call to the president of Taiwan, or accepting her call when he won election, that is verboten, and oh my goodness, that can't be done. And yet we found out it could be done, and it sent an important message, I think, to our allies, partners, and friends in China as well, that the United States will make decisions about how it conducts its business and its relationships with countries everywhere, informed by what other countries' reactions are, but not necessarily dictated by that. I think the same thing is true with respect to trade sanctions. Some of those were viewed by some as being very draconian, but we found out that those actions in of themselves didn't cause the crisis. Holistically, that remains to be seen, and I think that assessment is going to be ongoing, and we won't be able to draw conclusions for another 4 to 5 years about how effective this sanctions approach was. But the point to be made is, I think we were too constrained, that there was a sense of we got to stay in this box. We can't take decisions outside of that box. We have to think out of the box, and I think it's the government's role to make that thinking box bigger, to encourage other branches of office, other branches of government and the military to think in a bigger box.
One of the boxes that everybody is putting some intellectual energy into is what is the kind of force that we need to address the kind of force, then capabilities and approach that the Chinese are taking. We recently, Bob Work, former Deputy Defense Secretary, recently joined us and sort of made clear that the United States isn't preparing correctly for this, that the Chinese capabilities really are aimed at systems or network destruction warfare rather than force-on-force warfare, which is something I think that we tend to be a little bit more comfortable with. There's already been change in the joint force. Certainly Marine Corps Commandant General David Berger deserves credit for this new strategy to look at this new reality of increasingly distributed warfare. And when you were Pacific Fleet Commander, you wrote and thought extensively about Chinese capabilities. What's the right way to think about Chinese military capabilities and the capabilities that we need to be developing in order to address them? Because there's this tendency of thinking, well, they've got a lot of planes, we need a lot of planes. They've got a lot of ships, we need a lot of ships. As opposed to, well, what's the underlying strategy behind that?
Yeah, I listened to your podcast with Bob, and I'm grateful that we have strategic thinkers like him that are still engaged and are in consequential places and are thinking consequential thoughts about what the near term and midterm future might hold. Um, I am less concerned, and maybe it's because where I sit, about that we're not preparing properly. I more focus on the fact that we're not thinking properly. One of the things that Bob said in that podcast, and he's said this before, is that how he arrived at his conclusions about the approach that China is taking with their national defense is by studying their thought process, and his conclusion is that China made the decision that a force on force conflict was not one that was optimized for their ultimate victory, and that's what came to this systemized approach that China has embraced. So I go back to the thinking piece. I would suggest, and what generated my thinking, it really started as a strike group commander. Well, it really started in my experience as the deputy commander at NAVCENT, but began to form more fully as a strike group commander. And then when I had the benefit of sitting at Admiral Willard's right hand as the J3 when he was PACOM, is when my insights and understanding of how critical strategic thinking really was in operational planning and the tactical application of that plan. I go to A2AD as the example. So A2AD, Tom Mencken wrote a wonderful book on competitive strategies, which I have read and reread on numerous occasions. It's a fantastic book. I would encourage your listeners to consider it, to add it to their reading list. But in that book and in my thinking, coming from Admiral Willard's thoughts, was this idea that A2AD is really a cost imposing strategy. It's defensive in nature, it's not offensive in nature. It's meant to specifically target the offensive capabilities of the U.S. Navy in particular, and secondarily the U.S. Air Force. And the idea was if China could develop some low-cost defensive measures that were compelling, it might precipitate the opponent, the competitor, in this case, the United States, to respond by buying the risk down that was being imposed by these defensive systems. And that's what we've done. What we should have done, first of all, is think about strategically, analyze the plans that we had in place in the context of that strategic thinking and this new strategic approach, this A2AD approach by China, and develop a strategic plan first before we went down the operational path of throwing money at a problem that we didn't understand. The manifestation of that, I think, is what you see on the positive side in General Berger's thinking from his experience in the Middle East, which is extensive, his experience in the Pacific, which is extensive as well, certainly as MAR4PAC. And my bias view, I'm not speaking for him, but my bias view, it was really developed in the time that he had to think strategically about this at McCitic. And now he is applying it as the Commandant of the Marine Corps. What's most important is not the actions that he's done. You know, his comments, his statements about the sanctity of the number of amphibious ships, where he wants to be mobile and expeditionary, and he's willing to make trades, investments that have been made already that are not supportive of that ideal. Those are interesting to me, but they're not fascinating. What's fascinating to me is he continues to say, I don't know exactly where we're going to be a year, 2 year, or 3 years from now, the we being the Marine Corps. We have to do tabletops, we have to do exercises, we have to do modeling, simulation, and war game to plan this out. So this idea that we can come up with a plan, and this is, I go back to Bob Work's comment, and come up with a rubber stamp or a pill, a solution to this problem set is very problematic to me. That's my criticism of this administration and pretty previous administrations, is we're too crisis focused. At that level, we need to draw back. At the echelon 2 level in the military, we need to draw back, allow subordinates to handle the crisis du jour, and think more strategically about what is this problem sent to me, to your point that you made up earlier, that you brought up earlier about the impacts of the virus and how that might be weaponized in the future.
And I want to get to that in a minute, but is it helpful? The preceding Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, sort of wanted to snuff out discussion of A2AD sort of specifically. And then you mentioned, this is sort of a split question. You also mentioned hypersonics in terms of what the adversary has. It's a two-part question. Does it make sense to tamp down discussions like that? I mean, on the one hand, there is a view that military, conflict is about anti-access capabilities as much as possible. So that's not necessarily something new. I mean, I remember the chief of the German Navy said that to me. He was a Cold War German submariner. He said there wasn't a more anti-access place in the world than the Baltic at the time. And I was able to successfully, drive my ship and do what I needed to do, even in this environment. Is it problematic to sort of stop those kind of conversations? And is it sometimes as simple as, hey, the adversary is developing this, I got to get on the good foot and get this capability as well?
So I'll leave it for others to characterize the approach that Admiral Richardson took with respect to A2AD. I had pretty good insights into how challenging his job was as a CNO. But even with that, I would be very circumspect to be critical of his application of what he was trying to achieve strategically. But I do think that he did have the right approach with A2AD. If the message that was received was he was trying to tamp down that discussion, that's not reflective of the conversations that he had with me, and I know he had with others with respect to A2AD. What his goal and intent was to say we needed to think more broadly beyond A2AD. What is behind it? What is that strategy trying to achieve? It's just not anti-access area denial. It's playing chess. It's a move on the chessboard, and you don't look at the chess pieces that are adjacent to that last move. You have to look at the entire chessboard and think in the context of 2 or 3 moves ahead. That's what he was driving to. A2AD, the thinking in the Navy at the time, I'm not speaking for him in this case, but this is what was reflected in what he shared with me. This was my view. We were too focused on A2D. How do we counter A2D? That's not what it's about. If, God forbid, we get into armed conflict with China, how do we succeed? How do we win? What's the approach? A2D is a defensive strategy. It's not a winning strategy if you think strategically about it. Any professional sports team, they don't just field the defense. You can't win just on defense. What A2AD, it was enabling something else. That's what Admiral Richardson was driving at, and then understanding that something else. Again, the reinforcing of this embracing the rules-based system where you're advantaged and divorcing yourself of it where you're disadvantaged. That was really the strategic thrust that was behind A2AD, much more of a whole of government approach. And now I think this is a subject that you're going to want to get to eventually in this podcast. As a result of that, now we're focused on FONOPs as if it's going to make a difference in this strategic game. FONOPs, they're necessary but insufficient. It's not changing the needle in the strategic competition. It's just sending messages. And that's what I think Admiral Richardson was trying to expand the thinking within the Navy about thinking strategically about the A2D problem, and then developing plans that addressed it, didn't ignore it, that addressed it, but plans that were both more efficient, more effective, and more affordable.
Um, and when it comes to sort of outsticking an adversary, we've had this, which Bob is a great term that Bob Work always uses. The Chinese and the Russians have been working on developing longer sticks to keep us farther away. Have we been taking the right approach in terms of the strategic depth and the longer arms we have to grow? I mean, right, that's the biggest criticism of an aircraft carrier is great big ship, lots of short-ranged airplanes that aren't particularly useful. And I want to get into a broader discussion of that. But do you think that we need to be developing a different sort of approach to what that deep, long battle looks like in that environment? Because as John Greenert used to say, nobody ever defended their way to victory.
Yeah, I think that he was exactly right in that comment. Put it much more succinctly than I just attempted to in answering your last question. So I think longer sticks is important, but I think that's tactical. I'd like to see more thought put into what the operational plan is. I'll use DF-21 and DF-26 as examples. The longer the kill chain a weapon system relies on, the more vulnerable it is. I'll just leave it at that.
Right.
Based on the classification, I don't want to go more deeply into it. I would back away from this longer stick discussion directly and say that the objective, this is a wicked oversimplification, but the objective in warfare or in a strategic competition is to impose more cost or retain the credible capability of imposing more cost than your adversary can absorb. So this isn't just military cost, this is economic cost. So I have to believe that within the United States and many other countries, China included, there are teams that are very closely tracking economic recovery rates. And the country that recovers the quickest is best positioned to weaponize something like the coronavirus. And the reason I bring that up is why would longer sticks? Yes, but they don't have to be kinetic. They don't have to
Right.
be just cyber. We need, what are the black swans out there that we need to think of? Longer sticks are expensive. I'm very interested in hypersonics. I'm hypersonics because of their speed. The problem with hypersonics is they have a very long targeting chain. How do I specify uh, a point of arrival, that target point for the hypersonic, and feed that, directly into the weapon in a way that is resilient, one that can survive in a robust comms denied environment. That certainly, if you're fighting on your home ground, your ability to generate that comms denied environment is much easier than it is for those fighting the away game. So longer sticks are important. I've said this before. I think it's very important that we think deeply about developing weapons that are system agnostic. What are those weapons out there that I can launch from a Humvee? I can launch from an aircraft, from a submarine, from a ship. I want it to be shoulder fired. That's the design piece that I want to get to. I think that goes back to, the strategy that is running through General Berger's head. So yes, we need longer weapons, we need faster weapons, but we need to think in the context of what strategy are they supporting? How does that fit in the operational plan? And then what's it going to cost us?
Just the one question is, I mean, this pandemic is going to impose a tremendous financial cost on the nation as well. At the time when we're trying to deal with all of these other challenges, I mean, isn't that also a dramatically compounding element that has to fit somewhere in our strategic thinking of this? That the money that we have enjoyed might just not be there, even as early as starting next year.
My sense is, I'm not a budget expert, but my sense is that the 21 budget, regardless of the outcome of the November elections, will, that's kind of set in place. The big impact is going to be 22. But, the discussions that I'm involved with, and I should say I'm not involved in direct discussions with anybody in the Navy. These are tangential discussions with others. But the Navy has some huge bills that it has to pay. It hasn't been successful in trying to characterize Columbia class as a corporate bill, a DoD bill. So there's a bill that it's got to pursue. SSGNs is another bill or a different approach to take, but that's significant. That's coming. Carriers, regardless of what the near-term discussion is, we've got refueling and several that are in production. Now in the build phase, you've got the 355 ship Navy. You've got NGAD, whatever that may be, with a truncation of the Hornet buy to throw money into NGAD. Those are huge bills. I don't know how the CNO has a huge challenge in front of them of decisions to make to accommodate all those bills within the budget authority that he has now. Now you throw this coronavirus bill on top of it. This is truly a game changer. I think you'd be a fool to suggest that the DoD budget is going to stay flatline. And then if you read the things that we were talking about earlier about rhetoric, if you listen to what's coming out of the administration, that they've fixed all the ills of the previous administrations with DoD goes. We've put our money where our mouth is. We said our military was strong, but now we've financed that strong military. We've fixed all the ordnance shortfalls, and the story goes on and on. That may be turning into a discussion that supports moving money elsewhere where it's more critically needed from an infrastructure perspective of rebuilding the economy. How are we going to put all these people back to work? They're all not going to go back to work wherever they were working before. I mean, we're going to come out of this in a very different construct from a business perspective, from a government perspective, from a DoD perspective, and that is going to have some significant budget implications. So my response once again is we need to think about this in a strategic construct. And if you want a place to start, go read the Commandant's intent, Commandant's planning and guidance. Go look at his force structure statements. It's a very short read. And don't lose sight of the fact that he continues to say these are concepts. Some of them we can take action on now, but all of them we need to continue to model, simulate, experiment, tabletop, and wargame.
Let me take you to something you mentioned, and we talked a little bit about this before the interview, that again, we tend to think on force terms. We think of sort of the threat coming from a hypersonic missile, and yet America's only operational carrier in the Pacific has been sidelined by a virus. We don't know whether it's a natural virus or an engineered virus. Although, as you mentioned, nation states have worked on biological, chemical, and nerve agents for a very, very long time. In fact, the United States, would test biological agents on the American population to sort of see during cold and flu season how diseases would propagate and viruses would grow. And generally, bad Chinese behavior tends to happen when the carriers aren't around. There is a worry that having a fewer number of very, very big, very expensive things is problematic. That's one of the reasons why former acting Navy Secretary Tom Modly was working on a reconsideration of the supercarrier. I want to try to get to that in a minute. But from your standpoint, what is this entire virus episode? What are the lessons from the standpoint of a former Pacific Fleet commander we need to carry away from what we've seen? Because there wasn't a hypersonic weapon that sidelined TR.
So your question reminds me of a takeaway that I have from my experience at MIT and being immersed in the academic world, and that is old ideas being discovered by new people. So that this idea of Truman being sidelined by an illness and not by a hypersonic or a ballistic missile, DF-21 or DF-26. A lot of people might say that we didn't, that never saw that coming. My response is, well, we should have. And it's because my view is that we tend to be too crisis focused. The more senior you get, you need to extricate yourself from that crisis. I mean, there's so many great positive lessons in history. Eisenhower didn't send a single message during the Normandy invasion, the day of, because the plan wasn't set and he had delegated authorities to the tactical commanders. Any messages that he sent at that point would only serve to further confuse the environment. So the lesson to take away from this is something that we should have been thinking about, not just in isolation, but from a general perspective. The important point on the virus is the fact that it's contagious without symptoms, and the vector that I hadn't thought about are innocent vectors. People that are infected and don't know it and are traveling on their own business. I mean, there's no way that you can detect them through questionnaires, because what you get from a customs agent or that questions you at the port of entry, whether it's an airport or a harbor, because you're answering the questions honestly. I'm going to this academic convention, I'm going on business, whatever it may be, and the disease gets spread, and it may not, the ultimate target may be the military, but you may be infecting populations in an area adjacent to a military concentration. That to me is something that I hadn't considered, and I think requires more thought. The impact, certainly from a carrier perspective, I think it's fair to say that the impact is significant, but most of those sailors, it would be interesting to see the assessment of the combat effectiveness of the carrier in hindsight. Could we have put those sailors back on board? How many are asymptomatic? How many were ill but functional? It's the same as a kinetic strike on a carrier. Sailors are going to have to fight wounded, and it's much the same from this disease. And I just don't. I think there's a few of them, like less than 5, that are in intensive care. I don't know what the other categories of symptoms are. I would have to know that to do the full assessment of the operational impact on the carrier. Now we have the luxury of not being in conflict, so that we can sideline that carrier to get the crew well again as quickly as possible.
You're a naval aviator, but you're very unsentimental about aircraft carriers. As we said, Tom Modly was making a very thoughtful case on why it's important to rethink naval capabilities, especially the supercarrier, questioning whether a fewer number of very expensive ships was the right way to go, in part because of their cost and their vulnerability. Or is it smarter to have actually many, many more somewhat smaller ships to have a more distributed approach that sparked a very, I think, brisk debate in the Navy? There are some who've argued Ford-class carrier is the only way to go. That's the approach, and have a fewer number of these super ships. Where do you stand on this debate? And why do we need to reconsider the carrier? And what are the factors, the strategic factors in your mind that should drive that analysis, given that we don't, it's not clear whether that analysis is ever really going to start now that that Tom is no longer in that job. But what's your sense in sort of how we need to think about this?
I really like that term, characterize me as not being sentimental about carriers. I struggle with how do I describe my feelings about it. What I've said in the past
As
is
an old Harley driver,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So I am not one to defend carriers, but for those that suggest we should pursue another path, my first question is, what's your recommendation for the alternative? I have read what has been published publicly about Secretary Esper's view on carriers, and we need to reduce by 2 so that we can fund these unmanned ships. So that's one approach. There's some problems. There were some areas with that approach that I think need to be looked hard at. But in answer to your question, look, we ended up with carriers because the Japanese finally ended the debate over the preeminence of carriers or battleships with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So if the carriers had been out operating if the battleships had been out operating and the carriers had been tied up on their moorings in Pearl Harbor, we might be having an argument today about, has the day of the battleship uh, finally come that we should start thinking about what's next. Remember, we built carriers to defend battleships after the Air Force attacked a battleship and demonstrated the vulnerability of battleships to air power. We ended up with carriers as a fighting force because the Japanese sunk all the battleships in Pearl Harbor. What is the next Pearl Harbor event? That's what we need to think about. So I do think the CNO is right, and I do think Acting Secretary Moodley was right in generating this discussion. This isn't about rethinking carriers. We should have been thinking about this all along. So those that want to defend carriers, I say, tell me what you're defending, what your defense approach is, what your arguments are. And for those that want to get rid of them, I wanted to hear the same thing from them. So there's a part of return on investment. They are 50-year investments. So you have to take that into account, that the cost is mitigated based on its long lifespan. Granted, you got to do refueling. All those costs need to be included into it. Look, one of the greatest things that carriers did for me when I was in 7th Fleet and the Pac Fleet Commander is they generate 200,000 gallons of fresh water. That is critical when you're responding to a humanitarian assistance disaster relief. I mean, at Bondi Aceh, I mean, I can go through all the challenges, the HADR challenges that occurred, during the time that I was serving. That is so reassuring to those people and because water is the critical necessity that they need, fresh, clean water. Otherwise, you're looking at cholera, you're looking at all kinds of things. And oh, by the way, the water delivery is coming from the civil organizations within the country. So it's restabilizing the country and the people, the country, and giving the people confidence that the government can respond. I'll leave it at that point. There are many elements that come with a carrier that we will lose if we just go to a small force. The other point being is you have a very hard challenge if you reduce the number of carriers and expect to have any number of them serviceable. The Navy has continued to face this problem. Whoa, wait a minute. You got 12 carriers and you can only get 4 underway? There's all kinds of reasons behind that. It's the regeneration of the warfighting power of the air wing after it comes back from a cruise. It's got to reset, refit, rearm, and retrain. The same is true with a carrier. The maintenance that needs to occur on a carrier. So I don't know what that tipping point is, but if you reduce the number of carriers down to a certain point, you're not going to have enough that are ready to act as a credible deterrence force, which is a large part, back to General Berger's point, what he focuses on. And I don't understand fully, and I'm not in that circle, so it's unfair to take this as a criticism. But I would want to understand fully this fascination with unmanned. I'm a big proponent of unmanned platforms, but I'm a little concerned if we talk about when I hear the term minimally manning, uh, I get very, very interested. We went down that path in the Navy for a long time to pay other bills, and there are other reasons that we had the 2 collisions, the John McCain and the Fitzgerald in the Pacific. But a large part of that was the reduction in manning. And now, based on night courts and bills that the military is having to pay that are not direct military bills, one of the things the Navy was looking at, this was stated publicly, was reducing manning in FD&F forces. So that shows you how stressed the environment is. And when I hear of reducing carriers by 2, taking those savings and apply it to an unmanned fleet so that we can get to 355, I become skeptical. 355 is a number that we should not be pursuing. Show me the strategy first, and then let's resource that strategy. There's no magic about 355. I am not convinced that we can support a 355 ship Navy given the maritime infrastructure that we have at our disposal now. It's a challenge just to maintain the fleet that we have.
Right. Well, I mean, the interesting thing about that is, right, Cape does these studies all the time and is urging, right? I mean, so that's not necessarily new in terms of um, the metrics of that discussion. Completely agreed with that. Also completely agreed, right, that the carrier is the organizing construct of the Navy, and so it's important from that standpoint. And we are hard down with the ships, without trying to be critical of any particular person. But when Jim Mattis was CENTCOM, he demanded two carriers in the Gulf on a constant basis, and as a consequence, it's a nuclear plant, but it's a large gas tank, and at some point, those ships come due earlier than they would have otherwise, because we were driving them a lot harder than we anticipated to. Because you do come from an oil-fired carrier generation. One of the advantages of those old-fired ships, or if you look at maybe even a modern generation of aircraft carrier, for example, the British Queen Elizabeth class, very fuel efficient, very large, conventional, and with a drivetrain that's actually more easily maintained than a nuclear plant is. Do you think that there's a role for very large conventionally powered carriers to have, maybe not 9 or 12 5,000 man, 100,000 ton ships, but maybe 15, 20, a mix of carriers, and have more ships out there that still have a lot of flight deck, but maybe don't carry as many airplanes?
I think one of the most powerful statements a leader can make is, I don't know, because it generates a discussion within the staff. It's an empowering statement, and yet we're reluctant to say that. So my answer to that question is, I don't know. But we've got a great example of the path that Britain has gone down. And then we can look at the debate that occurred within Britain about smaller carriers or large carriers. So we should learn from that. I'm not convinced more is better. I'm a big believer in distributed lethality, but I would want to understand the lethality of the individual platforms. I think we need to look hard at what we know already about the Zumwalt class and electric power. I mean, it is phenomenal, the capability that the Zumwalt class has, just from a sound propagation perspective, from an energy management perspective. So they're Sea Hunter. Sea Hunter is another great program, largely an RDT&E program, that we need to take a hard look at. So it would be interesting to see what the proposed mix would be. It needs those studies need to be done against a backdrop and an understanding of what the strategic objectives are of the joint force. And from that assessment of the strategic objectives of the joint force, what are the strategic objectives of the naval units that support those joint force objectives? That's another thing that makes this broad assessment challenging. CAPE does great work, but too oftentimes CAPE only focuses on the high end, and they don't see the deterrence effect that occurs from the goodwill of what Navy units create with things like port calls and exercise participation. So it's a very difficult problem set. But in answering your question, I don't know. But what you're suggesting is something that we have to take on board and embrace as an integrated and integral part of any study.
Let me just go back to a broader question on China, and whether you believe China. There's this sense that China has a window in which to act, that after which its population gets too old, it doesn't have as many people. There are others who flip that around and say that a China at 800 million people is actually more dangerous because will be a wealthier society, not as many mouths, right? I mean, a lot of the challenges actually go away that you have now with 1.6 billion people. But at the end of the day, Xi got his lifetime term by promising the Council of Elders he's going to stick it to America and take back Taiwan. He had a whole series of setbacks. Now he has coronavirus. The Chinese Communist Party stays in power because of that delicate compact. You trade away your freedom for security and economic prosperity. The party is under challenge, and so it's done what every authoritarian nation does, which is ramp up nationalism and xenophobia, which then sets up potentially a really dangerous, certainly advantageous from a Xi standpoint, right? The people is now behind me against the other outsider. Does China become more dangerous in this next 15-year period? And how do we need to think about this next 15-year period? Because there were a lot of people who were like, hey, we got to stick it to China. There have to be reparations, any one of which is fraught with, right? I mean, you don't want to do nothing, but then you also don't want to, if you look at somebody as an enemy, they become an enemy. Do you think this next 15 years is more dangerous? And if so, how do we need to think about the next 15-year, 20-year period?
This is going to sound like a rinse, wash, repeat. But let me say up front that Xi Jinping, his coming to power as president for life is not a result of his sticking it to the U.S. I think it's much more strategic to that. I think it's about his promise to the Chinese people, the Communist Party in particular, and then the Chinese people, the reversal of the 100 years of humiliation and returning China to the power that it enjoyed as the Great Middle Kingdom. That's what this is all about. And the international rules-based order is in conflict with those goals. That's why they have to change the international rules-based order in some areas, because they can't achieve those strategic objectives without them. The rest of all these other things that are happening are operational and tactical things in support of those ultimate goals. I worry, in more direct answer to your question, I don't worry more about this, but the most consequential thing that could happen is the fall of China, not the rise of China. The rise of China managed within the construct of the international rules-based system and changing the international rules-based system to accommodate China's rise through discourse and dialogue is the path that we should embrace. China rises in that way, we all win. That's the win-win that we should be looking for. If China falls, it is a lose-lose. We all lose. They're too big of an economic driver. What's going to be interesting is what happens with this pandemic. So China's going back to work. It'll be interesting to see if there's a resurgence in the pandemic. But even if there isn't, where is China going to? It's an export economy. What are the markets that they're going to export all these things that they're building? I mean, everything is made in China because that's where labor is cheap. That's capitalism. So this is a two-way street. The last point, 2 points I would make. One is it's much more difficult, much more dangerous in the next 15 years. Up until really my time when I was the 7th Fleet commander in that time period in 2010, it transposes my time there, but I'd say from 2010 to 2015, China's grand strategy transitioned from a event-based strategy to a time-based strategy. So as events occurred around the world that China could take advantage of to further its strategy, it did. The last time that I'm aware, the last 2 times I saw them do this, one was in the Scarborough Shoal incident and the other was in the Senkakus. So those were events that occurred, the Philippine police action with respect to the illegal fishing. China seized that as an opportunity, as an event to implement a plan that was already in place. That's why they were able to move so quickly. They did the same thing in the Senkakus. They had a plan for the Senkakus. And when the mayor of Tokyo said that he was going to buy the Senkakus, he crossed a red line that was unacceptable for China. So based on that event, they implemented their Senkakus plan, but they realized they overreached. They didn't have the military capability to back it up. They declared the ADIZ and couldn't enforce it because they couldn't uh, command and control military force that far from China. They fixed that problem. They can do it now because they learned. So this is my concern now is they've moved to a time-based approach where they're marching towards this culmination of the reversal of the 100 years of humiliation and the return to the grandeur of the great Middle Kingdom, because of the demographics within China, because of the challenge that they have sustaining their state-owned enterprise business model. You cannot reverse what they have done in the South China Sea. That is a direct threat to the strategic objectives of the Communist Party and Xi Jinping. So it goes back to the thinking about these problem sets strategically, to really understand what the threat is that's resident within these actions that are occurring on the global stage.
Was there anything that we could have done? Because you were in command at the time when this island building was happening. Was there anything we could have done to have stopped the Chinese from doing what it is they did with these features?
So I think this is a point to take a playbook from the Trump administration. I think we should have. So this is we need to be more thoughtful. We need to be more patient. We need to be more transparent, and we need to be more assertive. Now, when I say we need to be more thoughtful, more patient, and more transparent, the people, you sound like a panda hugger. I am not. What I'm saying is that we need those three elements to consider the problem strategically before we turn back to kids' soccer and just react tactically. I say assertive and not aggressive. What do we believe our core interests are? I don't like red lines. I think we should think in terms of red zones. I learned that from the example of the Obama administration in Syria when we drew a red line with respect to the use of chemical weapons. What we should have said is, if you use chemical weapons, you are in a red zone with us from a national security perspective, and we reserve the right to act unilaterally. That is much more of a deterrent. If you draw a red line, you have just made a test case that whoever your competitor is can dance around to find out what your true resolve is. What level of deterrence is really there? So what could we have done differently? We should have been thinking differently about the problem. Same with the pandemic. We were too slow, in my opinion, to react to the pandemic because we were distracted by other things. We were thinking tactically and acting tactically, respect to a whole host of things, and not thinking strategically from not a national defense perspective, but from a national security perspective. National security is the responsibility of the whole of government. National defense is responsibility of the Department of Defense. And you can't have a national defense strategy and expect it to counter a national security strategy such as what we face with China.
How important is rhetoric in this conversation? Because as you pointed out, President Obama's critics did highlight that disconnect between language and reality because of the red line. And yet President Trump transitions. It's impossible, frankly, to know where he stands on some things, or at least so the saying goes, but on others, it's actually remarkably clear. For example, I think it's pretty clear the president looks at China as an economic issue and not necessarily a national security issue, that the trade deal and the economy are primary, and yet some of these other elements are less so. And it's very transactional. So it's a two-part question, because this then affects our allies and partners as well. Because when you have a senior Asian leader tell you, as look, not only do we all know it's an economic issue for your president, but unfortunately the Chinese also know it, and that makes it problematic for us all. At the end of the day, how important is it not to have a gap between your rhetoric and your actions when you are in a game this important and this dangerous?
Yes, I don't even like the term rhetoric. It's too loose. We need to be very clear, concise, and precise with our language that when it comes to describing what our national interests are. So that is one response. The challenge with being transactional is if your approach is a transactional approach, which I think it's fair to say that that is one of the core attributes of this administration. Everybody becomes transactional. That's not that does not bode well for any country who has an interest in global leadership. And I don't mean global leadership from ruling the world. I'm talking about um, being the advocate for democratic ideals. If you're transactional, we've got incredible partners throughout the region. And unfortunately, based on how transactional the US has become, I don't think culturally they've become transactional, but operationally and tactically they have. Um, they may argue otherwise, but I would suggest that that's true of Australia, Singapore, Japan, Korea, India. India, I would say, has been transactional for some time, but that doesn't bode well if you're trying to counter uh, a country that has a strategic objective of reversing the 100 years of humiliation. What I've said before.
Hmm.
China is extremely transactional. You are taking a page out of their playbook and executing it yourself. It's very difficult to gain advantage in that kind of environment. Um, and I'll use an example that a lot of those transactional statements are transmitted from the strategic level, but are tactical in nature. I was surprised by this latest tweet that came out about being intolerant of some of the activities that we see around some of our naval vessels with the Iranian, the IRGC in the Persian Gulf. Well, we've got ROE, we've got lots of controls in there, and I'm sure things are spinning at a robust level inside the Pentagon to understand. Okay, what does that mean? Um, the implications of getting that wrong are pretty high, and we could find ourselves in a position that we're regretting a tactical decision that now creates a strategic conundrum, especially if the message was coming from the strategic level. So this whole idea of rhetoric and a disconnect between our language and our actions is very problematic. I think from our own best interests.
Do you, in sort of 30 seconds, do you think that Japan and Korea, that there is a real risk Japan and Korea could tell us to buzz off? Because both of those nations are deeply insulted by this, and
Yeah,
nations that tend to not respond well to being insulted like this
yeah. So
culturally.
you have to do a full cost assessment before you can um, make a fully informed decision about the return on investment of U.S. forces that are sustained and maintained in Japan and in Korea. Um, so I think we need to be more circumspect about the approach that we've taken. I don't think Japan or Korea are going to tell us to buzz off. I think they're going to slow roll us, and that would not do well for both national defense or national security. Having those forces forward is a critical deterrent measure. And if that was that is, I mean, we're spending pennies on the dollar for what we get out of our relationship with Korea and Japan from a military support perspective, in my opinion.
Um, Last question, sir. There's a massive debate about leadership in the United States Navy. I know that that's something that you've spent some time thinking about, and there's a concern that what happened with Brett Crozier aboard Teddy Roosevelt wasn't merely about a captain that was overwhelmed, any more than the collisions of 2017 were about navigation. There's a sense that there is a broader leadership issue at play, and how, from your standpoint, what's your sense about the source of the problem, as somebody who spent his entire life in the Navy, and how best to correct it?
That is a great. That's a great question. You mentioned the collisions. This is another wicked oversimplification, but errors were made in each one of those ships by the leadership of those ships, and I think Admiral Alcuin did a fine job of addressing those errors. There were also errors that were made, not on, just on any one CNO's watch, on multiple CNO's watch, budget trades that were made that traded readiness for other things that the Navy, wanted to buy. And these decisions weren't just within the Navy; they were made within OSD. They were made by Congress. They were made by presidents. So that's a very, very complicated problem. And that has led to this erosion of trust, which is what I see the biggest challenge in the Navy right now. The thing that exacerbated it most, I think, is the whole Leonard Francis issue and Glenn Marine, and the fact that
The fat Leonard
yeah, yeah.
situation.
So everyone's guilty until proven innocent. People couldn't transfer, they couldn't promote if they were under investigation. It flies in the face of everything that we believe, that we draw from the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. It's demoralizing, but for sure it diminishes trust in an organization and within an organization. And so we lost so many great leaders that just had to leave because they timed out. The decision by justice just wasn't occurring in a timely manner. Those investigations take a long time. And Congress plays a role in this. Certainly senior leadership in the Navy plays a role in this. But the fact that people were put in stasis, they were put on hold, their careers were put on hold, some of them for years before they could promote. They timed out age-wise. Some of the people, rightfully, I don't have any issues with any of those that were taken to a civil trial by the Justice Department and found guilty and punished appropriately. Nor do I for the CDA actions that were taken. But some of the CDA actions, it's just a shame that careers were ended. That has created this leadership gap, this experience gap within the Navy. I'm not being critical of those that are in leadership positions now, but there are a number of people that had a wealth of experience that never had the opportunity to compete for those jobs. But if I had to say anything, I would say it's this diminishment of trust. You saw it in the send-off that Captain Kosher had from the carrier. To end on a positive note, Sino Gilday is a good friend of mine. I think he's the perfect guy to lead. But we didn't get into this problem in the last 5 years. We didn't get into this leadership challenge in the last 10 years. This has been 15 years in the making, and we're not going to get out of it in Admiral Gilday's tenure. It's really about setting a course that extricates us from this storm of uncertainty from a leadership perspective that the Navy's living within right now.
How much of this is about risk and risk management and risk taking and
It's
risk
all about
avoidance?
risk. It's all about risk. I mean, I think the Navy has always been, well, not always, but certainly in the last 20 years, I think one of the negative outcomes of Iraq and Afghanistan is this sense that we can buy down risk with money. Risk is a resource that we should embrace. I know we're running out of time. Maybe another time we can have a discussion about the key element that every commander has to own in warfighting is time. The commodity that's the commodity he wants to own. The currency that he trades in time is risk. If we're risk adverse, the probability of success is very low. So we have to be willing to embrace risk as a resource. And for those that I know in 04, 05, 06 command and on up, they are very circumspect about taking any risk on their own.
Sir, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. We really, really appreciate it. We've gone a lot longer than we normally would have, but it was an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for all your time, all your insights, and certainly look forward to having you back on again. Thanks so much again, and hope you and yours stay well.
Thank you, Vago, and I hope all your listeners out there are safe and healthy. I mean, these are challenging times that we live in that transpose many of the problems that we're talking about now. This is a time that we need to get focused on the crisis. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Look for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.